Right, well, the next area to consider and have an update on is the hate crime. And again, this is aligned with the police and crime plan, and obviously none of us would tolerate prejudice or want to see any prejudice, whether it's based on disability, race, religion, gender or sexual orientation. As it happens, in terms of the sort of reporting and increases that we have seen, the race hate does account for about 80% of all the hate crime that has been recorded. Again, just by way of a background, back in 2015-16, I did launch an extraordinary hate crime grant round at that time that put more than £112,000 into 12 projects across West Yorkshire. And in fact, in addition to that, there's also been £137,000 that supported 43 different organisations and projects tackling hate crime. So, you know, we are sort of very sighted on this. It is an issue that is often also discussed at our youth advisory group, and we have some good input and feedback from the younger people within that group. And I've met with MPs and many others who from time to time express concern about levels of hate crime, and of course we've got lots of diverse groups that we work with, from LGBTQ to Gypsy and Traveller group, advocacy groups, the Muslim Safety Forum, the Leeds and Polish Community Forum, just to name a few. So we will continue to work with those colleagues, and we've also done specific work in Bradford and Kirklees around, and Leeds for that matter, around individual district hate crime strategies as well. You know, it is something that we constantly work on, and of course we've had the Hate Hurts joint campaign with West Yorkshire Police running for some time, but clearly it's something we can't be complacent about. So I'll now ask you to update on hate crime.
Again, an incredibly important area for our communities in relation to hate crime, and making sure that people feel confident to come forward with their concerns about both crimes and incidents. Bearing in mind that this hate crime is any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or indeed any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice, and that's based on a person's characteristics. I think, again, it's important to just think about the context that we are reporting in today. We've got communities across West Yorkshire and beyond that right now are feeling very uncertain, very anxious about the future for a variety of reasons. First of all is the uncertainty about Brexit and what that's actually going to mean in terms of travel, in terms of people being resident here and so on, and it's being widely reported on at the moment, so that's generating its own angst. There is the risk of people being exploited, whether that's for sexual offending, whether that's human trafficking and domestic servitude, again a whole variety of other types of offences that are generating some angst in communities. You've then got the emergence of a lot of media reporting around more extreme views, more extreme groups, and on top of all of that, really wide coverage of international events, particularly only this week the issues over in Syria, which again are generating a lot of community concern. And all of that is sitting behind what then may be driving somebody's perception around why something happens or indeed doesn't happen. So I think it's important to labour that context, because what we are seeing is more people now coming forward and reporting matters to us because their perceptions are that it's based on some kind of hate issue. and it's important that we take it seriously and that we look into each and every one of those particular cases. So again, we'll take you through the current position and some of the activities that we are looking into to try and reduce some of those concerns. Catherine.
Okay, so as you mentioned, Commissioner, the very largest part of our hate crime and incident reporting concerns race-related hate crime and incidents. And we're running at around about a 16% repeat victim rate for hate crime, which is a steady state and is comparable with our most similar forces. So we're not out of kilter with anywhere else, but linking back, I'm saying everything's a priority for our neighbourhoods, but this is very much, for me, an area in terms of the repeat specifically, where the neighbourhood teams on a daily basis will understand and be able to flag as part of the technology that they've got to use where those repeats, even if it's just the second time something has happened to a particular individual, are happening, and be able to very quickly get involved and understand whether that's around a vulnerability of a particular victim for one reason or another, whether that's around some specific offenders, and whether there's anything that we can do to target either one or both of those things. So very much linked in with the neighbourhood policing model moving forward. I do think from the last kind of year of being here, every conversation that I've had around hate crime in West Yorkshire has been a really positive one, a very engaging one, and I do think our officers and staff really do understand the impact that this has on people and groups and communities in general, about how fearful people can feel around this kind of thing. And I also think now our organisation is mature in that not only we start to understand and predict when things happen. So we had a really difficult spring and summer last year, didn't we, with incidents that weren't specifically in West Yorkshire, but we now understand what our community engagement footprint needs to look like in response to that, and we're very, very quickly into some of those communities that we know will feel really vulnerable in terms of being reassuring to them. And I think a really good example of that was when we had the letters very recently, which weren't just a West Yorkshire issue, but did focus on some parts of West Yorkshire, and the reassurances and the links in with the partners and the elected members around that, I think was really outstanding actually, and made a very difficult situation better than it could have been for a lot of our communities, which I think is a really positive thing. I think you've picked up already throughout the report there is a lot of data in there, but other strands of hate crimes, including faith, disability, etc., are also increasing. And whilst we need to be mindful of those volumes, I think in some respects, as with domestic abuse, we need to accept that actually that is positive and can be put down to a number of things. There will of course be an element of the CDI effect in terms of us recording things more accurately. There'll be more victims coming forward as a result, as you've mentioned, of the Hate Hurts campaign and raising awareness of actually, sometimes I think people have a very fixed view of what hate crime might be, and some things happen to certain people and they don't actually realise it is hate crime or a hate incident, but because of some of that publicity and the way it's described, people understand what's happened to them and they'll report it to us. And then I've mentioned a number of significant incidents, and we've just had actually a court result in the last day or so in terms of one of our non-recent CSE trials that's been running. It's actually a Kirklees job that has been running at Leeds Crown Court, and we've just had guilty verdicts in respect of that. We know that there'll potentially be some fallout from that with certain communities on different sides of the viewpoints around that, and we've got plans in place already to deal with that. So that's how responsive we are. We don't just wait for things to come to us. We're also proactive with the messaging that we put out. And I think that's very much linked. There are, on each of the districts, with the local authorities, really strong links with community groups, with specific minority communities, that is building all of the time. There will always be things that we can do to improve and engage further with some of those communities. But I think there's also a really mature tension monitoring process that goes on across the local authorities with hate, crime and incidents, which again helps us to understand some of those emerging incidents that might not necessarily get reported as hate crime, but are flashpoints and indicators for us that things might not be well in a particular community, that we can then engage early with those groups. So the report obviously has the specifics in terms of the data within it, which I don't intend to go through in detail unless you want. I've got any specific questions on a specific element of that. I think satisfaction, again, it just follows the same comments that I've made throughout the afternoon. It's very much focused on keeping people updated. There are certain things that we can draw from the reflector groups that we've been running recently, in terms of we've had some of those reflector groups which have been entirely focused on people from minority communities, so that we can really drill down in trying to understand and ask what kind of things can make you feel more satisfied with what we do, and how we can manage your expectations differently.
What has come out of those specific reflections?
So we're just waiting for the final report. They've all been done now,
Yeah.
and the final report is going to come to the Local Policing Governance Board at the end of next week. So, but I've had from anecdotal feedback that I've had from people that have been present. I think they've been, some of the SLTs have gone and sat in some of those meetings, and they've said that they've been very powerful, very humbling actually, that actually people don't expect that much. That there is just some key, really simple things that we can do that can really improve things. So I think that'll be helpful, and with permission of people, we've videoed some of the reflections and feedback, which will then be able to play to a much wider audience, which I think will have a much bigger impact than, me doing a video or putting a briefing item out, for example.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, like I said, there is a lot of information in there, so thanks for the thoroughness of the report. On page 2, it does highlight that I think just 3% of all recorded hate crime is online. That does seem quite low based on what communities sort of say and what I hear sometimes. What more perhaps could we do to encourage victims of online hate or indeed hate crime anyway to come to sort of report online, perhaps more than what they are at the moment?
Okay, I mean, I suppose there's two things to say here. The first thing is to say that in terms of the threshold for proving offences online, it's quite high. There were 2 offences which I've had to write down here because I wouldn't remember them. Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003 and Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act 1988, which are perhaps more difficult to prove than face-to-face contact offences. I think that's the first thing to say in terms of sometimes we just don't get past that threshold. I think there's an education element with members of staff and members of the public actually. First of all, in terms of the people who are putting those messages out, where I think sometimes, quite genuinely, people don't think that they committed an offence. I think they forward things on, or they circulate things and things go viral, not realising that just by sharing something, they can actually be committing an offence. So I think there is quite a lot we can do in terms of prevention to help people understand that they might be committing these offences online. And then there is all the prevention stuff around online, being a victim of online crime, that applies to other areas of policing as well, that we can be, I'm saying more proactive. I think we are fairly proactive anyway with the hate hurts and everything that we do around We Stand Together and that kind of thing. So there's always more we can do, but I do think we're in a fairly good position in terms of the stuff that we do in terms of social media and helping people understand that. But it is quite a difficult, nuanced area, I think. It's not quite as clear-cut as somebody having that kind of contact in the street where they might, call somebody something particularly unpleasant, and that is very clearly an offence, versus some of the stuff that goes on online.
I think why this gets tricky is there isn't such a thing as a hate crime per se, it's an aggravated crime. And if you actually look, and I think you hit the nail on the head for me, Catherine, when you talked about these two particular pieces of legislation, the most recent is 2003. It's 15 years old, and I am not convinced that the legislation has kept up with developments around things like social media and so on. So perhaps that's something that needs to be addressed nationally, is the legislation actually helpful for the modern day world in terms of some of the communication? And then over and above that, the CPS threshold in terms of prosecution, as Catherine has talked about, is quite significant. So what we're talking about is something that is grossly offensive, which is actually more extreme than perhaps members of the public, when they're reporting these things, realise. And so it's not that we don't take it seriously and we don't want to deal with it, it's just the threshold in terms of a successful prosecution looks quite different than the threshold for something that might be more face-to-face, where the legislation is quite supportive. So it wasn't until we started to look at this that I actually thought the legislation hasn't kept up. So it's probably something that we do need to feedback. I will, obviously I'm down at Chiefs Council tomorrow and Thursday, and hate crime is one of the areas that I know that we were going to be discussing, so it might be something that I raise there as a result of the question that you posed.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because, I mean, on the one hand, you know, we don't want to make this something that, because of the volume of things that are on social media every day, you know, there's just an impossibility to keep up with everything. But nevertheless, there's a lot of criticism of social media companies on various things now, and obviously the whole debate around personal data and etc. etc. I think you're probably right, Dee, that the legislation is somewhat out of date with what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis now. But it's striking the balance, isn't it, of
that's my interpretation at this
yeah.
moment in time. So I think if I take that away to go and speak to the hate crime lead, which is obviously ATC Mark Hamilton, and pose that very question, I think it might be quite an interesting conversation to be had, bearing in mind the legislation, the most recent is 15 years old.
I suppose there's also the work that Ben talked about earlier about improving flagging, where we are talking about a substantive offence that has an aggravating factor of hate, and also has a cyber-enabled flag that needs to be on that. You know, when that work runs through, it might just produce a different profile and a higher proportion of online reports.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just on page 3 and 4, there is a quick overview of the trends across the different strands. And whilst most have sort of either stayed stable or increased over the past year, sexual orientation hate crime has reduced from 658 to 554 from April 2017 to January 2018. Is there a particular reason for that?
The reason for it is that, having reviewed the data, the numbers were wrong, is the reason. So actually it hasn't, it follows exactly the same trend as the other types of hate incidents. So there is a small increase that we're predicting of 9.5% in incidents and 20% in terms of crime, which is aligned with the other areas that you talked about. So there is no discrepancy in that, it was our numbers.
Yeah.
So just to correct that, for your records, the 790 figure that's in the table should be 594.
Right.
Which is in the text.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just an
admin
error.
Together. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. No. Thanks for that clarification. And again, we've touched on the outcome rate for disability hate crime and the fact that it remains low due to evidential difficulties. Is there anything more we could do to improve this, do you think, with partners?
Yes, I think we work generally across West Yorkshire with the CPS to dip sample incidents of disability hate crime on a regular basis to make sure that the outcomes are appropriate and that we're not missing any opportunities in terms of any part of the investigation, not just the evidential difficulties. Any lessons learned from that are communicated to districts and teams in terms of continued improvement. Just as an example of what we can do to work with some of our community groups, Leeds District at the moment are working with a group called United Response, who care for people in West Yorkshire and Leeds in particular with a disability. And the members of staff at United Response are being trained so that they can train other members of staff within there to better support some of the people that they care for, so that if they are victims of hate crime, there are things that they know to be able to talk about with the victim and put in place in terms of maintaining evidence, I should say, so that when it does come to us, we've got a better chance of getting hold of the people that are doing this kind of offending. So there is that kind of work being replicated in different areas, but that's just one example of where we can train people in the voluntary sector to help us with this, because they're the people that have the contact on that day-to-day basis.
And it's also about disability is the strand that I think is, from an officers and staff perspective, the most challenging, because it's such a broad spectrum of conditions. And sometimes it's not always easy, dare I say, to try and step into the shoes and understand the impact on the victim. And so raising awareness across all of our officers and staff, and of course we've got a very vibrant internal association who are helping us to do this, should also start to, I think, improve our understanding of what therefore the evidential requirements might be.
Yeah, no, and having sort of trained advocates and people who work with them, that's really important, isn't it, for them to sort of have that link, and obviously the neighbourhood policing cover will hopefully help in sort of establishing some of those better links as well. Okay, thanks for that.